Good morning, everyone. I'd like to call this meeting of the Policy Committee for the Hillsborough Transportation Planning Organization. If we could please stand and recite the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you very much. Roll call, please.
Commissioner Kemp? Commissioner Cohen?
Here.
Commissioner Smith?
Here. Sorry, here.
Councilman Maniscalco?
Here.
Commissioner Overman?
Here.
Charles Klug? Here. And we'd like to welcome TPO Board Member, Councilmember Citro. We do have an in-person quorum. Vice Chair, would you please call for a vote of consent for remote participation?
All right, do we have a vote for, for remote participation? A motion from Commissioner Overman with a second from? Second from Commissioner Cohen. All in favor? Aye. Any opposed? All right. We need an approval of the minutes from September 14th, 2022. Are there any questions, concerns? We have a motion to approve the minutes from Commissioner Cohen. Do we have a second? Second from Commissioner Overman. All in favor? Aye. Any opposed? All right, we go to public comment. I believe we have one registered speaker online. Would you like to begin with the registered speaker first or the in-person?
Yes, please. We have, I believe, Christopher Hatton signed up to speak. Is Mr. Hatton on the line?
Mr. Hatton has not signed into the meeting.
All right, do we have anybody in the general public here that wishes to speak, public comment on any item on the agenda? Seeing none. That concludes public comment. We have one action item. Mr. Wade Reynolds is here to present on the Plant City Canal Connector Trail Study. Yes, sir, go ahead.
Your mic.
Good morning, committee members. Wade Reynolds, TPO staff. And this is the Plant City Canal Connector Trail Feasibility Study. Next slide, please. Thank you. So the study area goes from McIntosh Preserve at Knights Griffin Road in the north, all the way down south of Alsobrook Street and south of downtown Plant City. Next slide, please. We looked at a number of routes and divided those into 4 zones. The southernmost zone, Zone A, is downtown Plant City and south. The next zone is from downtown to I-4. Zone C is from I-4 north to Sam Allen Road, and Zone D is through the Grand Isles, I believe, subdivision to McIntosh Preserve, north of Sam Allen Road. Next slide, please. We looked at each of the segment trails that we had taken a look at and scored each one based on a set of criteria, looking at the demographics in the areas through which they pass, the ease of construction, and any impediments that might be a hindrance to construction. Next slide, please. Through that, we came up with a set of preferred alternatives. This is Zone A, the preferred alternatives. And as we go from the south end of this, we're along an existing trail that the city has completed. They've done a great job with a lot of amenities, lighting, et cetera. We go along Alsobrook Street and then turn north, coming through Midtown Plant City, which is going through a redevelopment process. They've actually already done some of the streetscaping on that. From there, we go east on Alabama Street. It's an important connection because we do cross the railroad tracks at that point, and then north on Lake Street up to downtown Plant City. This section terminates at Baker Street on the north end. Next slide, please. Some of those features, again, we do have the existing trail and some of those streetscaping amenities that have been done in the Midtown area. We also do pass an elementary school on that part of the route. Next slide, please. Zone B, the preferred alternative, comes north from downtown along Pennsylvania Avenue. We actually pass two different parks on that part of the route, terminating at the Cherry Street Park, which is where it makes that little dogleg as it goes to the east. Where it's labeled canal there, that is another alternative spur that could take us up to the frontage road, and there are some advantages to that as well. For the ease of construction and timeliness of getting something in the ground, the recommendation is to take it over to Park Road, where we also meet up with Hillsborough Community College, the Plant City campus, and Sansoni Community Park, which has a number of ball fields and other amenities there. Next slide, please. One of the challenges, well, I'll get to that in a minute. So we can see here the HCC entrance, Sansoni Park, as well as the dog park and a couple of other amenities. The lower right picture is of the canal headed north from Cherry Street Park, and does have that great access road. I've actually seen people out there using it when we went out to take pictures. Next slide, please. Zone C, preferred alternatives. This starts north of the I-4 interchange and takes us up to Sam Allen Road, and then west for a small bit on Sam Allen Road. Next slide, please. One of the main challenges here, as you can see in the upper right photo, is crossing the interchange. That will take a lot of sensitivity as we make it across the frontage road and the entrances and exits from I-4 there. And then the lower left picture is along Park Road. There is quite a bit of right-of-way to take that north. It also is undergoing a resurfacing and rehabilitation project, which may be something that we can talk to FDOT about, including some of these efforts. Next slide, please. Zone D is when we get up from Sam Allen Road, headed north. We go along the back of the North Park Isles subdivision up to the south end of McIntosh Preserve. Next slide, please. And the left photo is the trailhead at McIntosh Preserve. The other two are from North Park Isles. There was a trail easement preserved through that subdivision to take us up to McIntosh Preserve. Next slide. So we were able to do a pretty successful public outreach survey with this. The picture on the right shows what we had as both flyers, and we set up that as large format posters in City Hall as well as Sadie Gibbs Martin Community Center. With those, we actually had paper surveys on the bottom in envelopes along with pins and a place to return the paper surveys. The QR code would take you to the website and web page for the project and the survey. And we ended up with about 240 responses, which was a pretty good response rate, certainly better than we get in a lot of things. Next slide, please. So we asked people, do you like the idea of connecting downtown Plant City to McIntosh Preserve? The majority, 88%, were in favor, 8% were opposed. Next slide, please. We asked people what kind of pathway they prefer, whether alongside public streets, where there are homes and destinations, away from roads as much as possible, or anywhere that a safe separated path can be feasibly built in the near future. And 54% came through with the third answer, anywhere that a safe separated path can feasibly be built, with away from roads as much as possible, a close second. Only 9% were in favor of on-side public streets. Next slide, please. We also asked, what would you like the route to connect to? Downtown was the major response, but Sansoni Park and Hillsborough Community College were also highly thought of. A number of other smaller parks along that route, as well as some schools and the historic boarding house museum was also mentioned. Next slide, please. So the selected alignment recommended alternative is as shown here. Next slide. We did have some sections created to help in the financial forecasting of this. The one on your left is a 21-foot section adjacent to a road. The one on the right is a 24-foot section. Just where you have more or less right-of-way, you would use one or the other. Next slide, please. And an independent trail sections as well, each 30 feet. Next slide, please. And then sections for those areas that would be alongside the canal with a railing or no railing, which has to do about the distance from that slope, whether you would need one or not. Next slide, please. And then a boardwalk area for where we have to cross a couple of low-lying sections. Next slide, please. The cost estimates in total, just over $11 million for the selected alignment. But if other changes to that alignment are selected, we can easily go back in and recalculate that for the city for their estimating purposes. Next slide, please. The implementation program, some ideas about signage, future home of the Greenway, working with FDOT and Hillsborough County on any crossings of their roads or any other projects that might be going on in the area, working with a private or design co-op organization, and just some initial implementation ideas involving roadway restriping and sharrows prior to construction of a full-fledged trail. And then looking on the front end for design and right-of-way funding, and then moving to construction funding. Next slide, please. Oh, and that's it. Staff does recommend approval of this study.
Do we have any questions for the gentleman? Yes, ma'am, Commissioner Overman.
Thank you very much, and thank you, Wade, for your work, and I appreciate helping residents understand what it takes to plan for and to invest in the future that they would like to see in their communities. I saw that you did a cost analysis, which was helpful, and was that presented to the public in these meetings?
The cost was not available during the surveying of it.
Okay. So while we've asked our residents what they'd like to see and what alternative they'd like to see, we haven't told them or disclosed to them what the cost would be, correct?
Not in the public outreach, no.
Okay, excellent. Additionally, in that $11 million or so, what percentage is actually covered by the state or other funding sources? And have we actually done an analysis to determine how much would be responsible by Plant City residents as well as the county residents?
We have not done that, although I will say that a good portion of it is proposed to be on Park Road, which would be a state facility, and we might be able to get some state funding as part of their resurfacing project. That's approximately 2 miles out of the total of around 6 miles in the selected alternative. So we would have to ask for that money as part of urban corridor improvements along that resurfacing route, but approximately 2/3 of that route would be on local roadways and would
Okay,
be.
because I think it's going to be important in the future, because we haven't done it in the past, and our residents don't clearly understand where money comes from in order to pay for the things they'd like to see. The Planning Commission has done an excellent job of creating a vision of what we would like to see and plan for, but the disconnect between how things are funded is very evident. So I'm going to recommend that that is part of the future surveys, because obviously you're already out there, that where we have a good, clear understanding or an anticipated understanding of who funds what in a project like this, that be part of the analysis along with the cost analysis, be presented in the surveys so that our residents understand, how much it costs to do stuff and where the money has to come from in order to be able to help them understand the value of investing in our communities that create the quality of life we're looking for. So thank you very much for your presentation. It was very informative.
Thank you.
Yes, ma'am.
Commissioner, if I could just add to that excellent point, the outreach about what do things cost, what funding is available, and what are our priorities as a community is an essential part of our long-range transportation plan and the periodic updates to that. So we will certainly be circling back to that in a significant way.
Any other discussion? No? All right, do we have a motion to approve this item?
So moved.
Motion from Commissioner Overman, second from Commissioner Cohen. Roll call?
Commissioner Cohen? Yes. Commissioner Smith?
Yes.
Councilmember Maniscalco?
Yes.
Commissioner Overman?
Yes.
Charles Klug? Yes. The motion passes 5-0.
Thank you.
Yes, ma'am.
As a follow-up, and I appreciate the idea that it's put in the long-range transportation plan, but when you lose track of what's in that plan, and it's, 800,000 pages long? While we're talking about projects, is when people have their focus on that, and I think it needs to be, and there's an opportunity to help our residents see it, rather than find the needle in the haystack in the, in the 2045 plan. So, or any of our long-range transportation plans. So if it's possible, when we are doing surveying and getting an indication of interest and we're helping people understand what we're planning for, I think it's crucial that we develop a financial plan and fully disclose the source of resources that would be necessary to make that plan happen. So if that's what we can work on and bring it back for board approval as part of our procedures, I would suggest that we consider doing that. So, thank you.
Thank you very much. All right, next up, we have status reports, the first being Tampa Moves Plan presented by the City of Tampa, my favorite city. I don't know who is here.
We have Miss Brandy Miklas
She is
on the
online.
line.
Okay. Brandy, take it away.
Good morning. Awesome. So, perfect. You've got the slides. So I just say next slide? Just want to make sure. Okay,
Yes.
perfect. Okay, good morning, TPO Policy Committee members. I'm Brandy Miklas. I'm the Infrastructure and Mobility Program Coordinator for the City of Tampa. And I'm here to give you an overview of the latest on Tampa's citywide mobility plan, Tampa Moves. Next slide. So just to give you an idea, or just a quick, overview of what you'll hear, I'm going to tell you, kind of where we are now, kind of existing conditions, baseline, how did we get here, talks a little bit about the previous conversation about funding and priorities, and then what do you want Tampa's tomorrow to look like? Because Tampa Moves did not just, this process for the mobility plan did not begin this year. It actually began a couple years ago, and we had some listen first meetings at the beginning of last year. So we were able to gauge from the public kind of what they wanted for Tampa's future, and then how we get there, how we be able to achieve that future. Next slide. So where are we now? Then next slide coming up gives you some data points. There's a lot of data. Some of the ones that I like to focus on are those first two on the top row. We have City of Tampa owns over 2,200 miles of road. That's over 2,000. We have over 150 bicycle facilities. That means bike lanes, basically. Over 50 bridges. So you can see we have a lot of assets that we currently maintain. Next slide. Our funding sources. So our number one source of funding for transportation comes from the gas tax, the local option gas tax. That's our primary funding source. We do not receive funding for transportation in the City of Tampa through property taxes. So you can see that we do have quite a few sources It's not that we don't have a lot of sources, we just don't collectively have a lot from those sources. So on average, we have about $11 million to maintain our assets and to also add improvements to our system. Next slide. And here's a nice, just a visual overview of some of the services we do. You know, we maintain our bridges, we fill potholes with our Fix It Fast program. We have our amazing boots on the ground operations. That's a good example on the photo on the top right, where whenever we have a special event, they're out there putting cones up, maintenance of traffic, detour information, are always stops. We sweep our streets. We have street sweepers, and we even have one mini sweeper for bike lanes, and we hope to increase that fleet, but right now we have one mini sweeper. Next slide. And then we also have existing conditions, our needs. So just to give you an idea, how much does transportation cost? It's different where you go, but for the city of Tampa, roughly 1 mile of sidewalk costs $800,000. And we, on average, pave about 30 miles of roads every year. So we have 2,200 or so miles, and we get to about 30 a year. And that takes just under 5 million to do that. And then one new traffic signal, 750,000. So not an inexpensive endeavor. Next slide. So our current funding is not keeping up with our maintenance, just basic maintenance. We did a pavement condition assessment of all of the city roads, and we found that the pavement condition, 40%, so not half, but still quite a large number, are in poor failing condition. We have quite a few of our major bridges that are in desperate need of rehabilitation. Some of those are some of our gateway bridges into downtown. Cass Street is one of them, Cass Street Bridge. Seawalls need to be replaced. And then unfortunately, over half of the 500 or so traffic signals we have are nearing or are at their end of their useful life. Next slide. So sorry, I feel like I'm getting towards the end of this section. It's a little bit of a downer. I'm gonna hopefully raise some of you up with some hope, but we all know that there's a problem. Potholes, no sidewalks, sidewalk gaps, I should say. And yet we spend a lot of time, if we're not able to walk and bike and take transit, we're behind the wheel, we're spending a lot of time in traffic. Next slide. This is another visual. Actually, if you go to the next one, you'll see a number. Yeah. So that number doesn't represent 2,000 or so roadway needs. It just basically means that unfortunately we're on a 75-year paving cycle. So what that really means is if we started today, we could finish repaving all of the city's roads in 75 years, which means in 2097. So kind of grim too. Next slide. Roads in Tampa are unsafe. Next slide. Waste a lot of time sitting in traffic. Next slide. Oh yeah, over 48 hours on average a year. Next slide. And we're growing rapidly. That's a fact. You can see that between this slide and the next slide, we basically had a new city built within downtown Tampa in roughly 5 years. That's Channelside Drive and Meridian, where Water Street is. So if you go back to the previous slide, you can just see just the rapid growth and change that the city in this region is experiencing. Next slide. Okay, so how did we get here? Let's move on and yeah, next slide. So this great film. This film came out in 1993. 1993 was the last time the gas tax was increased. So Next slide kind of gives you a graphic visual. Basically, we're trying to communicate here that even though gas prices are increasing, next slide. Oh, I'm sorry, maybe we removed that. The main goal, the main point that I was going to get to with the previous slide, apologies, I was just a little bit out of order, is the gas tax is based on consumption. So what that really means is if gas is $2 a gallon and then it goes, unfortunately, to $5 a gallon, we don't actually receive any additional funding because it's consumption based. And with vehicles becoming more fuel efficient, it's really just it's just unfortunately not driven by inflation, or I'm sorry, not driven, but we are not getting additional funding when inflation and fuel prices increase. Next slide. So, great comic, Dilbert, very wise. Our old ways of doing things won't work anymore. So here comes, next slide, Mayor Jane Castor in 2019. She took office and she created a strategic vision called Transforming Tampa's Tomorrow. And part of that Transforming Tampa's Tomorrow has a major transportation component. And there are visions, or that vision is on the left-hand side, implementing strategic transit projects, adopting Vision Zero, trails, greenways, reinventing urban parking and mobility, and enhancing neighborhood engagement. Next slide. So here's where I was going to show you what we heard when we went out to the community early on in the moves process. And what we heard from folks, this is what they want for Tampa, how to get around. So next slide. Reliable infrastructure. Next slide. More options. More options, absolutely. Next slide. A robust transit system. Another Water Street example. Next slide. I love this one. Streets as places. Just making streets more people-oriented. We heard that a lot. People wish they could walk and bike and take transit more, but they don't feel terribly comfortable doing so. We want to have streets that are more like places. Next slide. Safe streets, streets to walk your kids to school or just walk in your neighborhood. Next slide. And a resilient city. Next slide. Oh, I'm sorry. This is the last one. We also heard that people want equity in their decision making. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that in the next series of slides. So here we go. Next slide. How will we get there? Next slide. So that's where Tampa Moves comes in. So Tampa Moves is, it stands for the items you see on the left-hand side. Those are our guiding principles. So what we've done is this data that we're collecting, not only the pavement condition assessment that I mentioned earlier, we also looked at our high injury network, and what that translates into is where are crashes occurring, and where are crashes occurring that result, unfortunately, in deaths and serious injuries. So we're taking that data, and then we're also taking the data and pairing it with these guiding principles. So I have one example for you. Next slide. To show you, seems like, all right, I can speak to the example. We took sidewalk gaps, we identified sidewalk gaps in the whole city, and then we looked at the, I thought we had a visually, I'm so sorry. Actually, do you mind continuing to the next slide? Just want to see if I was just ahead of myself. Okay, sorry about that. Project identification and prioritization. So when I was referencing guiding principles, moves, identifying gaps is the first step, identifying solutions, potential solutions, and then prioritization. So that prioritization goes into those guiding principles because we have metrics that help us weight the priorities. So an example of that is the sidewalk prioritization that I was about to talk about. Next slide. So we have a massive sidewalk gap in the city. We know that, but we wanted to see it and visualize it. So we put all the gaps on a map. We looked at the guiding principles, created criteria so we could make sure we had weight on which ones should go first. If we have funding to build more sidewalks and fill gaps, those would be the ones that go first. And the next slide gives you a visual of, next slide, please. Where we took those, our sidewalks located close to schools? Are they located close to transit stops? And we looked at that kind of information, and then we took the prioritization tool and we compared it to the requests we've been receiving through our customer service center. And we looked at the requests from the public. An example of this, our prioritization tool clearly states, if you're not familiar with that part of the city, that's Sulphur Springs. Lots of needs. And we realized there weren't a lot of requests coming in from the public. So we want to make sure that we have that equity and we're really looking at the data and what it's telling us. So this is an example of that. Next slide. Okay. So this is still a part of that question of how will we get there. So the moves commitment with our citywide mobility plan. We listened last year and we're out again. We want to make sure that we get it right. We didn't miss anything. And again, I mentioned the data. Data is so important. If you have good data, you'll make good decisions. And then, of course, compare those decisions and the data with folks that are living and breathing in their neighborhood, how they're getting around. Distribute resources equitably. For that fourth item, align resources and policies. We're trying to do things differently. We want to be fire preventers and not firefighters. And what that means really is having policies in place that will help us move Tampa into a safer, overall safer system. And then the last two items, the fifth one is extremely important right now, seeking funding from every possible source. So we're going after grants, we're going after all kinds of opportunities, and we're not going to stop. And then we want to make sure that the decisions we make achieve the greatest impact. Back to that prioritization. Next slide. So this is the last slide I'll leave you with, and we had a Planning for Tampa's Tomorrow town hall. We had one last night, and we have two more coming up. Next week on Tuesday is a virtual one, and then October 24th, there's our final in person. That one's going to be at Forest Hills. The tampa.gov/planning town halls will tell you everything you need. And then our citywide mobility plan, Tampa Moves, our project website's right there, tpamoves.org. You can request a presentation, tell someone who might be interested they can request a presentation. And we plan to finalize our mobility plan at the end of this year. Thank you.
Thank you very much for a wonderful and depressing presentation. And the reason I say that because it's very frustrating. We know the discussion with All for Transportation in these last few days. We hear from our constituents daily, when are you going to fix the roads? When are you going to build the sidewalks? This intersection is very dangerous. And this is just within the city of Tampa. But it seems like we're never going to catch up. And when we try to catch up, it's an obstacle or a roadblock or a legal opinion or decision that stops us from being able to serve. So my question before, and I know I should open it up to discussion first, but the local options gas tax. From my understanding, the county commission has to vote to, a max of like 5 cents per gallon?
5 cents per gallon is a supermajority vote on the county commission.
And that would generate what, like $1 million per penny, something like that? 5 million a year, or it's 5 million per penny that it would dedicate towards, these types of projects. I don't know. But, I think we should look at all options because, we're not going to be here in 2097. Maybe I will. I don't know. But that's a long way to go from where we can catch up on all these projects in the city. And our paving budget within the city of Tampa, I believe, is around $5 million. Yet we have, a mile of sidewalks is just under $1 million. New intersections, which need replacing, that's right under $1 million. So it's like we're never going to make real progress other than paving a road here and there every so often. And when we try to do the right thing, we want to go to the sales tax, and let the voters decide, again, another roadblock. So anybody have any questions or comments? Yes, ma'am.
Thank you. I feel your same frustration. Last year, when I brought up the idea of a gas tax, at the board level, there was little appetite for it at the time. The other problem we have is the gas tax is based on the tax per gallon, whereas every other sales tax associated with a tax on an item that you purchase is based on the dollar value of what you spend, whereas our gas lobby has been effective at limiting it per gallon in that sense. So it's not relative to how much money you spend on gas, it's relative to how many gallons you buy. And that actually creates a deficit in the revenues available to fund for transportation when the city is highly dependent on it. The slide that we saw earlier broke down where the monies come from as it stands now, which was very effective. And I don't know if the coins are representative of the percentages in this illustration, but it does appear as though 25% of your transportation dollars are funded by the gas tax, and you've been creative at the city level at finding other ways to pay that, as well as at the county level, because we do the same thing with developer impact fees, which pay for future growth. They don't really pay for past deficits. Right-of-way permitting fees, red light camera funds, which we've had some pushback by some parties that find that to be not as effective as generating funds or don't want it in general. And community investment taxes, we heard, will not be renewed or increased by voter referendum until 2026.
Yep.
Is that correct? So those are dollars that are not available. And then is it my understanding, for the public's knowledge, that most of the grants would require you to have local funds in your budget in order to be competitive to receive those dollars? Is that accurate statement for the most part?
I would call it, if we have dedicated funding, or I call it a down payment, then we get the matching funds. Then, we can go to the state. Then we can, do something meaningful. When they say, okay, like in the sales tax, it's a 30-year fund, and that's a 30-year commitment, where other governmental entities can say, okay, you're doing your part. Now we'll match it, or we'll help you, and then that's when we can make real progress. But without that dedicated funding, and you brought up CIT, that's what's worrisome. What happens when that runs out? 30 years went by like that, because I remember when that was being debated, and 2026 is around the corner. Then what? We look forward 5 years, and so those funds are allocated as we know what's coming in, but what if it doesn't get on the ballot? What if it does? If it gets on the ballot and doesn't get renewed? We saw the school tax. We see all for transportation twice now with the troubles. Then what do we do? Because the city, as was presented in the presentation, it's growing very rapidly. And this is just transportation. What about housing? That's another, if not the biggest issue. We are becoming overwhelmed with the demand out there for infrastructure, maintenance, housing, and so many other issues. But to answer your question, if we don't have dedicated funding a lot of the times, some kind of source, then we're out of luck on some certain things.
Well, things have to be paid for,
Yep.
Bottom line, and that's what this presentation illustrates. And unfortunately, there's a small group that don't want voters to vote to pay for things. And unfortunately, the reality is that financial responsibility has to be there. And the consequences of not being able to ask voters, whether it be the CIT tax or a sales tax or actually any other tax, not being able to pay for it means you don't have resurfaced roads. We have a 75-year schedule. So, continuing to look for other alternatives is important. But this presentation shows, that of all the people that live in Hillsborough County, that oftentimes will drive through the city to get to their jobs of employment. Some of the roads that we own, that the county owns, for example, Waters You know, Howard Avenue Wouters looks just like Howard. I mean, it's really sad that we have a situation where we have roads that are in such bad shape that the emergency pothole service, I forgot what you called it, was your your Fix It Fast teams, which is a creative way of getting that addressed to avoid further damage to vehicles, but it still doesn't really address the need of our residents that need to be able to get down the road safely without causing themselves or other folks harm. So we clearly have a problem, but that's part of the reason why I asked for the early consideration of showing individuals that attend meetings and say, yeah, we'd like to see this happen, a clear presentation that helps them understand where the funding comes from so that voters can make an educated choice on how we pay for things in the future. So thank you.
Thank you. Anybody else? Is Commissioner Smith on the line? No? She didn't have her hand up.
She is, but she does not have her hand up.
All right,
I'm here.
thank you. Yes,
I'm here, but I'm just enjoyed the presentation very much, and as well as the discussion, and share your frustration.
Thank you very much. All right, next up, we have a wildlife permeability along I-4 presentation from FDOT. If they are not here, they may be online now.
They are online,
All right.
sir, both Mr. Johnson and Mr. Setchell.
Thank you very much. FDOT, if you'd like to begin, go ahead.
Good morning. I'm Brent Setchell. I'm with FDOT District 1, but I'm here representing the Panther Recovery Implementation Team, the Transportation Sub-Team. And a few months ago, we had submitted a report on the I-4 wildlife permeability, and this presentation was requested to kind of give you an update. So you want to go to the next slide? So just quickly, you all know where I-4 is at, and then the red dots here represent Panther vehicle collisions. And so just to give you an idea, there are a couple within in or near Hillsborough County. So next slide. So the study that we submitted looked at essentially several crossings along I-4, or several wildlife corridors crossing I-4. And so the one particular was in Hillsborough County, and we're going to kind of zoom in on that detail. If you want to go to the next slide. And so hopefully you're all aware of the plans for I-4 within Hillsborough County. The PD&E study was approved back in October of 2019. It's almost 25 miles of widening, and will include 2 buffer separated express lanes in each direction, and then a 44-foot wide transit corridor. Currently right-of-way or nor construction is funded. Next slide. And so this is an excerpt from the study that we submitted, the report that we submitted, and it shows essentially Plant City. There's the 2 orange lines there represent what we call least cost pathways, which are GIS models that look at the land cover data, and based on beginning point and end point, they estimate where a wildlife will likely to cross based on the land cover data. And so if you go to the next slide, it kind of puts it in a portrait view rather than a landscape view. And you can see the connecting conservation lands on either side of I-4. And notice that the one potential crossing highlighted is east of Plant City near the Polk-Hillsborough County line. And then, however, there is another corridor that was identified, also west of Plant City. That was, again, through that least cost pathways modeling. So that's essentially what we're looking at is if there, what plans are there to kind of, increase the permeability for wildlife, not only across I-4, but in the connecting lanes as well. Go to the next slide. Again, this is just an excerpt from the report kind of detailing some of the information that was looked at. Specifically, east and west of Plant City are large swaths of agricultural lands. Those agricultural land uses have shown to be compatible with panther movement and foraging activities. And then there's looking at opportunities to, with FTACs and creating or expanding existing agricultural preservation zones using Rural and Family Lands Protection Program. and other, land conservation programs. Can we go to the next slide? This is just an excerpt from the Hillsborough County future land use map, just essentially showing that, kind of that eastern Hillsborough County, a lot of its zoned for, or future land use is shown as agricultural uses. So again, compatible with, wildlife corridor. Next slide. Similarly, this is the Plant City future land use map. This map actually has the wetlands kind of shown in the pinkish color there. And you can kind of see on either side of Plant City, there are substantial wetlands, which usually translates into floodplains as well, that are difficult to develop, that could become a wildlife corridor, again, with appropriate protections and other roadway improvements to allow better connectivity. Next slide. So District 7 has done a wildlife camera study along I-4 of the existing cross-drain structures, the drainage structures that are there, to see if any wildlife was already using any of the existing structures. And if you want to go to the next slide, they kind of split it up here in kind of an eastern and western section. And so the results of that study are still to be determined. They're still ongoing. They had some issues out there, but they're still collecting data out there to see which wildlife are utilizing, again, those existing structures, to see if any of those can be rehabbed or, retrofitted to enhance the permeability for wildlife. Next slide. Again, just taking a closer look at that, that crossing east of Plant City, or potential crossing there. You can see the least cost pathway there is kind of following that floodplain corridor. I think it's English Creek there, which crosses over into Polk County. And you can see the panther death there on the Polk Parkway. I think that occurred back in 2017. Next slide. And so again, there aren't any Florida Ecological Greenways Network critical linkages along the I-4 corridor through Hillsborough County, and there are limited conservation lands on both sides of I-4, making it a real challenge today. Again, some of the habitat on both sides of I-4 isn't exactly suitable for, it's certainly, panthers would move through there, but they're certainly not going to breed or, feed through there. But they would use some of those agricultural lands. And again, anything done on I-4, we have to look at those roads that also parallel I-4 to see if any improvements are needed there, including US 92. Next slide. Again, this is just an excerpt from that Florida Ecological Greenways Network and the critical linkages, and you can see the section kind of there in Hillsborough County lies in that priority 5 area, which again isn't critical linkage as far as that goes. Next slide. Again, so FDOT is actively pursuing improvements for wildlife permeability along I-4. And I think there's several bullets here, so you have to click through them. Wildlife corridors need to be preserved and to ensure the viability of proposed crossings. Next, there you go. So again, it's about building partnerships with, the local agencies, including yourselves and NGOs and, landowners and so forth, to try and create these or preserve these corridors. And then again, the roadways, both state and local adjacent to I-4, need to be considered for wildlife crossings. I do see a hand up. I'm not sure if you want to wait to the end or we can take it now, either one.
All right, Commissioner Smith, your hand is up. Yes, ma'am?
Right, I'm just in line for after the presentation. Thank you.
Okay, very good. So again, and I think, having better awareness of that Florida Ecological Greenways Network at both the local planning and permitting level is needed, just to understand that, hey, these corridors are important to preserve, wildlife and allow them to, move throughout the state. And next slide. We're at the end. We can take any questions that you may have.
Commissioner Smith.
Thank you very much. And thanks very much for this presentation. It's really important. And I'm really glad that FDOT is starting this process of looking at how we can ensure the sustainability of wildlife in Florida as we grow and develop and build infrastructure in order to accommodate not only preserving wildlife habitat, but connecting pieces of wildlife habitat to grow the habitat bigger, but also just to be able to allow a single panther to occasionally cross from one piece of habitat to another in order to extend the gene pool, right? And connect the gene pools into viable panther genetic expansion, so that, because one of the problems specifically with the panthers at one point was the gene pool got so reduced and so limited that we had in the Florida panther some really limited genetic things cropping up that threatened the whole existence of the species. So they need to be able to, we had to bring in, if you recall, cougars from, I think, Texas or Colorado, someplace out west, to mix in the genes. But that's a plan B. What we really need to be doing is ensuring that all our wildlife, from panthers to bobcats to foxes to raccoons to gopher tortoises to burrowing owls, everything, are able to move to other genetic sources and in order to do that themselves. And I see in this study that as you begin thinking about how to allow wildlife passage and connect wildlife habitat around and through your infrastructure, FDOT infrastructure, you're looking at first at the engineering, at the very high level comp plan maps of where the big picture colored areas of agriculture uses or wetlands are, where the any preserves are, and you've start out with cameras at existing structures and looking at things like lease cost and where the parallel roads are. And this is all very, very important starting point of engineering from a road building perspective. Where would it be easiest, cheapest, most possible to put wildlife corridors? But now what really needs to happen, and I think your presentation alluded to this, is to connect not just with the other agencies, with the governments, with us, but to talk to our local ELAP, conservation lands management. I understand that has not been done yet. I reached out to them to have a quick look at this, and wildlife experts need to be brought in to put on their thinking caps and help you find creative solutions beyond what you might think looking at the road system, but looking at what scientists and wildlife experts know about how far any of these specific species actually do travel, and where bears or anything else might be able to go, and how that could be accommodated. And we may need to also look at not just okay, what's the simplest way to do this from where we are now, but think about, do we need to acquire certain pieces of property in these corridors in order to make a real connection somewhere? And as you mentioned, do we need to look at some parallel roads or other roads in order to make that happen. But I just really want to say, I think the very next step is to bring in our ELAP experts, as well as, and I know FDOT works with wildlife consultants who understand each species movements and what they need in order to make these crossings and corridors and habitats connections really viable. So we are leaving a legacy behind us of the wildlife still living with us in Florida. Thank you.
Yes, ma'am. Commissioner Overman.
Thank you, Commissioner Smith, for making those observations. I appreciate it too. And thank you very much for the presentation. You know, we have, you know, the Wildlife Corridor Project, the Florida Wildlife Corridor, made it really clear that road crossings are challenging for our wildlife when that study was done and when that project was completed by Carlton Ward Jr., I think. But one of the things that I'm curious about, we're in the process of looking at how, you know, I-4 is being reconstructed to create the corridor down the middle for transit and other, whether that be whatever, whether it's bus or anything. And when we do that, there are probably a significant number of bridges that go over swamps and wetlands. And I was curious if FDOT has in its design, for example, whether it's 75 or I-4, has developed a opportunity to design those bridges with sufficient underpaths or paths that are appropriate or attractive to wildlife so that they could get through. Because if that reconstruction of parts of I-4, which seems to always be under construction somewhere, where bridges exist, it would seem as though there is a real opportunity. And where water crossings occur or swamp crossings occur would also seem to be a great opportunity. It is somewhat evident in the presentation that there's been some focus there, but it didn't seem to do the connection part. And that's why I was curious. For example, I happen to know that, not that everybody's excited about having coyotes in the city of Tampa, but they travel along the Hillsborough River. They come out of the Green Swamp area, come out through our rural areas and through our agricultural areas, and then travel into the urban core where there's easy small prey along our rivers and urban communities. But having our rural agricultural folks at the table too, I think would be of value because they're committed to keeping open land. And they've participated in a great way of being conservation partners along with ELAP. But so I think there's some opportunity to see where there may be in those pink corridors on the slide where you show a number 5 priority, which is in Hillsborough County. It may be because there's so much development around it. But I would suggest to you that that's not all of the agricultural land that's in Hillsborough County. It's certainly not all of the ELAP land in Hillsborough County that can create that opportunity for wildlife of different sorts to travel through. So I think it's great that we're doing this, but I think there's a broader spectrum of opportunity in areas that do not appear within that illustration that we're taking advantage of it while we can, especially as I-4 is being reconstructed for a multi-mobility type of solution going forward. So I'll just stop there, but unless there's some comment from our presenter, thank you.
Yeah, I'll just quickly add that certainly as I-4 is redeveloped, we have in our design manuals that any bridges that are reconstructed or new bridges, there's a requirement now for us to look at opportunities for wildlife connectivity. And so there's a memo that goes to towards that speaks to that, and it's required for every new bridge project. So certainly we'd be looking at that, whether shelves are appropriate to add on let's say either side of a crossing or something to that effect. So and then again, as we noted, the the wildlife camera study that was done, again, kind of helps us gauge, where, if there's any crossings that are existing today that wildlife are utilizing, we certainly want to make sure that we're not, precluding that moving forward. We want to make sure we can enhance that and make it a better opportunity for wildlife as I-4 is developed, so.
Thank you.
Anybody else? Hearing none, thank you very much. All right, our final status report is regarding some citizen concerns on the air quality at the I-275 construction. Do we have someone from the EPC here? Yes, sir, go ahead.
Good morning to the TPO Policy Committee. My name is Jason Waters. I'm with the Environmental Protection Commission, professional engineer. I'm the manager of the air monitoring section. Today, we gave this presentation to the recent EPC board meeting, and Commissioner Myers asked us to share it with the TPO as well. Next slide, please. So first, we're going to give some just general air quality information, and then we'll talk about the I-275 in the latter part of the presentation. Next slide, please. In Hillsborough County, we operate a pretty extensive network of air monitors at 11 sites. We have over 30 monitors. It is the largest network in any county in the state of Florida. At those sites, we operate continuous monitors for ozone, nitrogen oxides, carbon monoxide, sulfur dioxide, and particulate matter. There is one site cited by on Monroe Street near I-275 called our near road monitoring site. Next slide, please. That site was built as after the 2010 revisions to the monitoring network required us to do monitoring if you had a large enough core-based statistical area, and the Tampa-St. Pete Clearwater met that criteria, and the heaviest traffic intersection was I-275, I-4, and by locating the monitor there, that is considered the worst case for air pollution along the roadways. And it was determined to determine compliance with the federal standards. Next slide, please. So ozone is a pollutant of concern just about in any medium-sized to large metropolitan area. And the thing to note here is this chart shows the days above the current standard. And the ozone standard since 2000 has been revised twice or lowered. And it went from 80 parts per billion to 70 today. And the number of days obviously has decreased significantly for the current standard, and there's about 4 of them. We do meet or attain, is the word in the regulation, the ozone standard set by the US EPA. Next slide, please. So a lot of people have a question. They say, well, we meet the standard, but I read a report the other day that says, I saw you got a grade of an F. And so there's a lot of other nonprofits or entities that do their own assessment of air quality. And one of those is the American Lung Association. While we meet or attain the EPA standard for ozone, which is set and reviewed every 10 years or so, in conjunction with the National Academy of Sciences, the American Lung Association assigns Hillsborough County a grade of F. So some people say, well, how do I get there? If you look at the green chart at the bottom, you'll notice that Hillsborough County gets assigned the day of F for 4 days above the ozone standard. Los Angeles County also gets assigned an F for 114 days above the ozone standard. Those 4 days, again, EPA, there are some certain numbers you can have a few high days and still attain the standard, and that's where we are. We are in attainment. Next slide, please. Similarly, fine dust, or we call it PM 2.5 because it's very small. And over the last 20 years, the standard was lowered. We do attain that standard. And next slide, please. Similarly, the American Lung looks and publishes their data on fine dust. So we attain the EPA standard. We get a grade of B, and you notice there's a little asterisk there. It was a single high rating at one of our, a single monitor in Hillsborough County for the night of New Year's Eve. One night, it was probably attributed to fireworks. So a single night gets you a grade of B. So I want to point out that, again, we attained the standard, but sometimes these other grading systems are a little bit arbitrary how they pick the days. Next slide, please. And my favorite part of this slide is the bottom right-hand. You see the human hair there, and you see that PM 2.5, and that really is 2.5 microns. And the human hair is, what does that say, 50 microns or so? So we're talking about really small, fine dust. And you can see that there's other pollutants we do monitor for throughout our network. And so we have a very comprehensive monitoring system here in Hillsborough County, really the largest in the state of Florida. Next slide. Okay, yeah, that's fine. We're going to move to the I-275 results. And a couple things the commission, EPC, asked us to take a look at. The FDOT had some reports that were provided by third-party environmental contractors regarding paint on the bridges up and down the 275 corridor, and a dust sample that a local citizen had obtained and had analyzed and said it was, above the ambient air quality standard. Well, the dust sample was really collected as a solid, not a breathable sample, which is where it's collected through a high volume sampler over a period of time. So when you compare those dust samples to the Florida residential cleanup level, both are well below that number, and no further action would be necessary. Next slide, please. Based on that, and based on some of the concerns, we were able to site a temporary lead monitor at the Seminole Heights Branch Library. I'd like to thank our library folks for helping us get that sited out there. And you can see that the bridge is in the background on the left. We put that monitor up, did a few background samples. We ran it during the test period, which actually happened to be the week of the hurricane. We did run it, picked up those samples. The demo's completed, and we're going to be presenting those results once we get through our QA process at the EPC board meeting next week. So we will have those for the EPC board next week. Next slide, please. One of the other things, there was a question about what does it cost to operate a lead monitor. So to operate 4 of these are manual type samplers. Someone has to go out, set it up every time. That's the only way to measure lead using an EPA standard. It's about $250,000 a year. And in order to do that, we got to have a piece of property with a big enough open area. We have to have permission from the landowner, and we have to have electricity, continuous electricity for the monitor. Next slide, please. And the staff recommendation to the EPC board a few weeks ago, the last meeting, was that we report back to them with the results, so we'll be doing that next week. And that if the results were below the lead levels, we would ask that the district secretary, the District 7 secretaries, ensure that they use the best management practices on all roadway and demolition projects. And that's the conclusion of my presentation.
Commissioner
Any
Overman.
questions?
Thank you very much for your report. That was very, very helpful. You mentioned that the report that'll be presented next week to EPC was based on the study of the air quality at the Osborne location, which actually I live right there, so thank you. But that was done during the hurricane week? When did that start and stop?
The actual samples occurred before the hurricane. I believe the demolition was Sunday night, so there was not a rain event or anything. They did the demolition Sunday night. The monitor was running, and it also ran the following Monday night, but demolition was completed.
Okay, yeah, because I do know that FDOT worked very hard to try and shut down their operations and clean things up in preparation for the storm, but that the work had not really gone through that week. So if it was actually the week before the storm, then it might have been more representative of the kind of impact that the construction, if that was the question, that we were trying to get an answer to, might have caused versus just the general pollution at that location. Is that accurate? I mean,
Yes,
when
I
you
mean, to
say-
clarify,
when you say destruction, I mean, you mean taking down the monitoring? Help me understand what you meant.
yes, to clarify, I'm sorry about that. When we were talking about the demolition, it was the demolition of the bridge, not the monitor. The monitor is still there, just physically. But they actually did that bridge demo work that Sunday night before the hurricane arrived. We went out Monday, even though the county was closed, we picked up that filter to make sure we had it because we knew how important it was. And we did set another one to run, but really the demolition, we did capture the demolition activity on the filter. So that's what we'll be presenting next week.
Excellent. Thank you very much for your work. I appreciate it.
Anybody else? Thank you very much for the presentation, sir. We appreciate the information. Thank you. All right. That concludes status reports. Any old and new business? Hearing and seeing none, we are adjourned, and we will be back as the full board at 10 o'clock. Thank you.